Hello all. In our last lecture, we talked about the transition from the late medieval to the early modern world. And in this lecture, we're going to sort of as our off-ramp from the Middle Ages and on-ramp into the early modern period, we're going to talk about the calamitous 14th century. I have a picture of a book by Barbara Tuchman, A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century. This is a popular but solid history that introduces introduced to wider audiences the horrors of this century. Even in its own time, people wrote that they were living in horrible times. You think you've seen memes about how bad 2020 is? Visit the 14th century, although there weren't memes at that time, but contemporaries thought they were living in rough times. This right here is a late 15th century woodcut by one of the most famous woodcut artists of the early modern period, Albrecht Dürer, of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The four horsemen of the apocalypse comes from a biblical passage in the book of Revelations, chapter 6, where a passage describes the coming of four different horsemen bringing death here, and they're pictured left to right, death and famine and war and plague. Well, many people considered that this was what the 14th century brought. It had all of them. And we are going to I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing to you what were these four horsemen of the apocalypse, so to speak, or the four catastrophes, the four horsemen of the calamitous 14th century. And I'll say right up front, we're fairly clear on what three were, but then a bunch of other bad things happened. So in the Revelations, just one of the horsemen is death, and there's a whole lot of that, and there's some overlap. So I'll leave it to you perhaps to decide what you think the fourth horseman is. And to be clear, this isn't a concrete model, and even if the four horsemen of the apocalypse analogy was invoked, it is by no means the case that everyone walking around at the end of the 14th century was thinking of that imagery. So one of the first tragedies of the 14th century was the Great Famine, and the Great Famine lasted from 1315 to 1322, and it was a series of failed or nearly failed harvests. There were 14 continuous bad harvests in a row. If you are in an agricultural world with limited transport, limited options besides growing your own food, this is catastrophic. Looking back at historical climatology, we now see that this series of poor harvests took place on the cusp of what we now call the Little Ice Age. The dating of the Little Ice Age varies. Some people say sometimes it gets broadly defined as the 13th to the 19th century, or more narrowly defined as the 16th to the 19th century. And oh, that reminds me. Oh, sorry. That reminds me. And here's a book by Jeffrey Parker, Global Crisis, War, Climate Change, and Catastrophe in the 17th century, that I highly recommend reading. It's a sweeping look at all of the tremendous war, collapse, dislocation that happens in the 17th century. And Jeffrey Parker attempts to make an argument that it is linked to climate change and the Little Ice Age. That's a little bit farther away from the period we're talking about right now, but as you see from this graph at the bottom, it's the end of what is known as the medieval warm period. So it gets colder, it gets wetter, and harvests, some fail entirely, and the ones that don't in that span of time are from 1315 to 1322 are quite poor. During the medieval warming period, harvests had been good. And recall our lecture about the Cistercians engaging in efficient farming, engaging in clearing forests and land reclamation. They are increasing the amount of food that is being grown, and they're doing it in large part on marginal land. Well, when times are good, the seasons are warm enough and the conditions are right, marginal land can produce. But when conditions are bad, marginal land is particularly bad. And so this contributed to hunger and people not having enough to eat. There'd been this the extension of arable land when things turned bad created real demographic suffering. Rainy winters weren't the only problem. Rainy winters contributed and cold summers contributed to failed and very poor harvest. That wasn't the only problem. Also a problem was a great moraine, or a dying off of cattle and animals through some disease or set of diseases. People relied on their animals for eggs and milk and meat. And so this compounded the catastrophe that was taking place. Food prices went up, mortality rates went up tremendously, maybe 10 to 15% higher. The late historian William Jordan estimated that in Northern Europe, perhaps 1/10 of the population died of starvation. 10%, that is a very large number. Those that didn't die, however, were weakened. And a weakened population is more susceptible to disease. In the 1340s, there were 6 months of continuous rain in one year, in which no crops were sown and people slaughtered what animals they had to get enough calories to live. In Florence, down in southern Italy, or central Italy, down in southern Europe, on the Mediterranean, the city-state took the measure in 1347 of initiating communal distribution of the grain ration. The state hadn't been so hands-on previously, but it saw that the threat of starvation was at its door for a significant portion, for a significant portion of the population. And so it was deemed absolutely appropriate for the public good that the state needed to step in and redistribute resources so people wouldn't starve. Historians think that because of the Great Famine of the early 14th century, the population of Europe was less prepared to weather the bubonic plague, and that previous catastrophe contributed to the magnitude of the Black Death in Europe. And so the next horseman of the 14th century is the Black Death. And you've written papers on that, so I won't belabor it too much, but what do we know about the Black Death? Well, the Black Death came to Europe through probably Caffa to Italy and into the rest of Europe. It had been endemic among Mongol populations and throughout Eurasia. There's lots of questions and lots of research that continues to go on, as you know as well, from becoming familiar with the new research of Hannah Barker, where she says that contrary to this previous previous understanding that the Mongols had catapulted poisoned body parts into Kaffa during a siege of 1347, she doubts that this had anything to do with spreading plague to Europe. Rather, plague came to Europe on grain ships throughout the season of 1347, and it came through various vectors, not just one. At any rate, it hit European shores and wreaked tremendous damage. Probably at the end, more than half of Europe's population died. The worst years were 1348 to 1350, and then at some level it petered out. It spread different places at different rates and got to the northern parts of Europe a bit later. But even after that initial onslaught, plague returned and was endemic in European populations well into the 17th and even 18th century. There's even into the 18th century, there is a plague outbreak in London in 1660. There's a plague outbreak in Russia in 1771. Here is a map of Kaffa on an ancient city on the Black Sea, and also Tana is another ancient city on the Black Sea, and both of these places were vector for transmission in the mid 14th century. We now know that plague was spread through Yersinia pestis, a common bacterium in rodents that is transmitted in fleas that live on those rodents. The fleas prefer the rodents, but they'll move to other animals, cows or humans, if they have the chance. And that bacterium was discovered by the French bacteriologist Alexander Yersin in 1894. He identifies the bacillus that is named in his honor. But people of the time didn't know that that was the cause. And there were a variety of explanations proffered. Was it divine wrath? Was it poisoned air? Miasma theory was very much in vogue in those centuries. And it was the idea that poisoned air was the cause of spreading disease. Some thought, was it Jews or lepers that were poisoning wells? And it was not, but those populations suffered persecution as a result of people who thought they were to blame. They didn't know the cure. I'm going to just adjust the screen here. They didn't know the cure. And so all they could do, they didn't have a medicinal, a pharmacological solution. So all they could do was things like try isolation and social distancing and lockdowns. And those were the types of things that they did. They isolated the sick, they quarantined, they burned contaminated things when people died. They also invoked their faith and tried public penance. Flagellants emerge in the 14th century as people that would beat themselves in public processions, as if maybe this'll work, maybe this public prayer that imposes suffering will reach God in a way that he wants to act on. Pardon. Now here are several images, and these are not plague, although they often circulate as being plague, and the historian Monica White has at some level made it her mission to correct these errors where she finds them. These are all images probably of people suffering from pox or leprosy. When people had plague, and there were three types of plague. Bubonic plague was the most common. Pneumonic plague affected the lungs, and then septicemic plague was 100% fatal it seems to have been. And these were variations caused by this bacterium. Here is a picture of bubonic plague, and it had big bulbos often that would appear around the thighs or the lymph nodes. So not all over the body, but in these particular places. As Monica Green has made more and more clear in her research, we don't have many contemporary pictures of what plague looked like from the 1340s when it was happening. We do have the most graphic description of the time was left to us from Boccaccio, the author of the Decameron, who wrote, and the Decameron is a collection of stories told by Florentines that had fled the plague and were kind of collecting and sharing stories in lockdown. And in his prologue, Boccaccio offers one of the most famous descriptions of plague in European literature. He says, in men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. And he goes on from there. If we don't have contemporary pictures of the plague, we do have contemporary images showing the suffering, the death, and the social dislocation. This chaotic 14th century image shows people digging graves, bringing coffins to bury the dead, both in boxes and there in the center of the picture, a wrapped corpse. So the plague reaches southern Italy in 1347 and spreads fairly rapidly. Here is a somewhat less clear map, but maybe a little bit more geographically detailed about where it reached when, which I won't belabor. Those are just a few words about the plague. Moving on to a next horseman of the apocalypse of the calamitous 14th century, let me bring in the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War lasted from 1337 to 1453, but it is important to understand it is not a century of continuous fighting in this war between France and England. There were times in which, well, medieval warfare was always seasonal. It's not fought year-round. And there were also years in which there weren't campaigns, and then things would heat up. Ultimately, the result of this war is that the English that the English king is ousted from the continent, and we end up with a France that looks more like a France recognizable to us today. The 100 Years' War also brought us Joan of Arc, who was a young girl who had visions that she was supposed to lead a French army, and she persuaded French noblemen that she was indeed that. And she was a real rallying point of inspiration during her short life, until she was captured in battle, and actually captured by French nobles allied to the king, and turned over to the English, who put her on trial for many charges, including heresy, that her divine images, that her divine visions were according to English inquisitors, demonic. And she was burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431. She was only about 19 years old. Just a couple decades later, an inquisitorial court actually pronounced her not guilty. And in the early 19th century, Napoleon declared her a national symbol of France. In the 20th century, she was beatified and canonized. So she is now Saint Joan of Arc. And her history is, her life was lived in the context of the 100 Years' War. Another consequence of the 100 Years' War, not just of the 100 Years' War, but an important an important change that we want to keep our eyes on as we understand how Europe and Western civilization develops as it does, is that states grow. Fighting wars requires money. And so kings need to get money, and they get money by taxing people. This is going to be, we'll keep our eye on this ball when we talk about the military revolution. France has a standing army. England puts in a poll tax, and these demands on populations at large don't come without tension. And so we see one of the things that we see in the 14th century are a number of peasant rebellions. And this, you may, some might choose as a pick for the fourth horseman. And we see rebellions in France, the Jacquerie in Paris in 1348. We see in Flanders, up here in the Low Country, textile production place that is kind of in tension between France and England. It does gets much of its wool supplies from England, so it needs to be in good relation with them. And at any rate, in Flanders, you have a major peasant revolt, and merchants are also part of this in the third decade of the 14th century. And then in a couple decades later, you have another really major outbreak in Paris. An even more famous peasant revolt takes place in England in 1381. And this really is a remarkable episode in history. And maybe one of the reasons we think it's remarkable is because we have an anonymous chronicler who left an eyewitness account, as far as we know, of some of the goings on here. But at any rate, in the midst of the 100 Years' War, and the English king needs more, the English king, Richard II, needs more and more finances to keep his armies in the field. And they had imposed a poll tax. That's a tax per household, but it hadn't really been collected. And in an attempt to kind of get the books up to speed and collect from everyone who's outstanding, that was sort of the catalyst that lit this fire across much of southern England, where, and the chronicler described it thus, that whose people made, the tax collector came to say, I'm here to get your taxes. And then the people made answer that they would not pay a penny more. The said commons assembled together to the number of some 50,000. We should always be suspect of numbers whenever it comes to battles or groups in historical manuscripts. But nonetheless, if it's even a fraction of that, that's a major number coming together to oppose tax collection. To the number of some 50,000, and they went to the manors and townships of those who would not rise with them, and cast their houses to the ground or set fire to them. What happens in this, there's multiple leaders, but it's often called Wat Tyler is one of the main leaders of this event. John Ball is another leader. They're both depicted in this manuscript picture. And the peasants' revolt, as it gets going, initially the King Richard, he meets the protesters, he addresses them, he accedes to their demands, including the abolition of serfdom, but he will later revoke all those promises, so they won't stand. But what happens is, while he is meeting with this group, another big crowd, and maybe this is them depicted here, go into the Tower of London, and they take some of the hated officials, and their demands were specific. these officials are part of the problem. We want them ousted. Richard doesn't agree to oust them, but a different group goes and they take some hated officials for themselves and they kill them. Some women are involved even as leaders of this rebellion. And then the next day, Richard goes out again, and it's unclear exactly what happened, but Wet Tyler is killed by a local William Walworth, who Richard quickly knights. And subsequently, Richard will gather forces and the rebels will be brutally put down. Perhaps 1,500 people were killed by the king's forces. And I just want to show you in this manuscript depiction that King Richard appears twice. And that is not entirely unusual in reading medieval manuscripts. Sometimes action is unfolding and you can even see the same figure twice in one picture. And that is what is happening here. At one point, he's looking on to Wet Tyler being killed. And here he is addressing his people. Another potential horseman of the 14th century was the Ottoman advance. The Turks, that we will come to know as the Ottoman Turks, had been advancing across the Anatolian Peninsula, and they cross the Bosporus Straits into southern Europe, and they take territory in the 1360s. There's a very famous Battle of Kosovo in 1389, and this sends fear throughout much of Europe, and it's a catalyst, in fact, for various alliances against the Turks. In France's case, they'll ally with them, but the papacy, for example, will reach out to Russia to try and form an alliance against the Turks. And a final horseman of the 14th century is sometimes considered the crisis in the papacy. And those are two major crises. First is the Avignon papacy. From 1309 to 1376, there were 7 different French popes that were seated not in Rome, as had been the tradition, but in Avignon, France. And during this period, these popes were very much seen to be puppets of the French king rather than the true, correct leaders of the church. And many called this period the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, by Babylonian captivity, hearkening back to the Jewish exile in Mesopotamia for years before the Persians allowed them to return to the Levant. And this, as if this wasn't bad enough, there's a great schism that happens in the church, and this begins in 1378, not to be confused with the Great Schism of 1054, where the Eastern and Western churches, or the Orthodox and Latin churches, split in two. But the Great Schism begins where there are multiple popes at the same time. The cardinals elected an Italian, Urban VI, and then meanwhile, someone else is elected pope in Avignon. We don't need to go into these details, but now there are simultaneously two popes at the same time. And then even at one moment, there'll be 3. The issue is ultimately resolved through a multi-year council called the Council of Constance. And historians say that the Council of Constance ended up having some beneficial outcomes, and that was the solidifying and articulating of papal law and papal canons in ways that were productive for later development of later legal theory, etc. But in the moment and while it was happening, and overall, these episodes, the Avignon Papacy, that sense that the Pope is not his own leader of the church receiving God's word, the word of God, but kind of receiving the word of the King of France and a puppet to the French king was tremendously damaging for the church, as was the simultaneous existence of different individuals claiming to be the Pope. And so in a world, we might say, gosh, compared to the death and famine and war and suffering that we've seen, it seems to not even compare this this wrangling at the top of the pyramid of this clerical hierarchy. But I think that in a world where religion was so central to the lives and understanding of so many, if not in the minds of peasants out in the field who were the majority of people, certainly to those in leadership roles with any sort of authority, this was a painful rift and a very unhappy episode in the history of the church that ultimately served to diminish its prestige. And with that, we will wrap up and continue next time with the military revolution.